performance solution. As most of you know, my name is Chantal Newman. I'm from Dan Europe and the Diver Medic, and I'm the host of these webinars. For those of you who are attending today, thank you so much for your time and your effort and for joining us today, and hopefully you'll have a good time. Hello, Anthony from Freehold, New Jersey. So if you can just tell me who you are and where you're from, that'll be absolutely awesome. And in the meantime, I'd love to tell you a little bit about Grant. So Grant, obviously, he's been freediving since he was 6 and learned to scuba dive at 12. He's been teaching diving for over 30 years. He's a Trimix instructor trainer and PADI course director. He also teaches rebreathers. He's a US Coast Guard captain, an EMT, and a DAN examiner. He has a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology, a Master in Science in Emergency Management, and is about to complete an MBA. He has been technical diving for over 30 years. His cave diving includes work in Mexico, Riviera Maya, I hope I pronounced that right, Florida, Brazil, California, Honduras. He is an award-winning director, cinematographer, photographer, and author. He devotes time to helping the aquatic nonprofit Cambrian Foundation and the American Red Cross. He is active in international freediving as a judge instructor, and he has consulted on several diving programs for multiple agencies. Now, that was a bit of a mouthful, but I'm sure you have loads more to tell us. In the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Grant, and he's going to take you through precision diving. So all the best, Grant, and I'll see you on the other side.
Thank you, Chantal. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. And precision diving has been a work I've been actively working on for over 20 years. Came out of a place, kind of a combination of places. One is I was teaching and running kind of straight on agency programs and realized I had divers that were coming out not super excited and confident doing their first dive out of instruction. That kind of scratching my head and going, there's probably an issue there. And then all the way up to technical diving, where I've had really renowned and well-known technical divers. One particular project, we had very rough seas. It started very calm. It was about 100 miles offshore. And after doing our hangs for decompression, that diver kind of later in the day sketched up a technology fix for the difficulty that he had maintaining stops and buoyancy. And I kind of listened to this and smiled, and I raised my hand and I said, how about we fix the diver first? Because the technology solution wasn't really needed. Some of us didn't have the same issues. So this came about as a result of kind of needing what I felt was a performance fix. This is not a class in precision diving. I do those as free orientations. This is on a Creative Commons license, so if you want to borrow or adapt or modify, as long as you credit precisiondiving.com, you're welcome to use, abuse, steal this. Just respect the name Precision Diving, if you would, please, as intellectual property of mine. Beyond that, I want to cover kind of the where, the why, and then get into some of the details without actually teaching a class. We just don't have time. And some of this is about mindset, and that's really where I come from. So if you could, in your chats, what sport did you guys play growing up? Swimming, cool. Swimming. Squash, soccer. I guess we should call soccer football if we're talking to Europeans. Rugby, you're crazy. Rugby's hard. Wrestling, football. Okay, that's awesome. I just like to get a background. Now, in all those sports, I was a swimmer too. Growing up, I played soccer. I also played baseball and basketball and played football in high school. So in all those sports, I had somebody really good at it I could look up to. For me, Mark Spitz as a swimmer, that's really dating me. Maybe Michael Phelps for some. Maybe that's even too dépassé for some younger folks. Every one of those sports, we had somebody in basketball, I could look at Michael Jordan, or Magic Johnson I was a huge fan of when I was playing as a kid. Kobe, more recently, LeBron James. We all have a person of esteem that we can look to, a person we can idealize, and you can get an idea of what an elite athlete in that sport looks like. I want you to keep that in mind and think back to who you look to in those sports that you're mentioning. Oh, somebody said volleyball. Cool. For me, it was St. John Smith when I was really young. I'm really dating myself. And I was lucky enough to play with some of the Satos who were on the Olympic teams, male and female, as a kid. So, yeah, I love volleyball. I want us to think about, what is the number one rule in scuba? I think we all know this one. Let's fill it in the text box, if you would. What's our, always say the number one thing we're supposed to do? Don't hold your breath. Don't embarrass your instructor. That means you take ownership of the results of your training well after the training. I'm not sure you should do that. Keep breathing. There we go. Breathe. Yes. To look good. I love it. Don't run out of air. Never dive alone. Okay. This is funny. I love it. Good answers, everyone. Well, here's the question. How are you told to breathe? Go ahead and fill that in. Oh, good. I'm glad Chantel's laughing. This is great. Slowly, slowly and steady. Somebody from the UK, imagine. Relaxed and normal, slowly. Not through my nose. Put a mask on. That will stop that quick enough. Put your face in the water. Deep and slow. There we go. That's what I heard too when I was coming up. I was lucky enough to learn to dive when I was 12. Saw a scuba diver in real life when I was 11. I had been free diving for quite a while in an ocean camp that summer, and went into the shop and said, I want to learn to dive. And I answered honestly when they asked me how old I was. I'm 11. I said, you got to be 12. You can imagine my parents' life. I didn't shut up for the next year. Not that I shut up now. So 3 days after my 12th birthday, my mom gave me to the dive shop. Don't give them back to you. Shut them up, because I was just diving all the time. So deep and slow. Now here's another question. Was that ever actually taught to you? Was it ever demonstrated? Some no's already. For the vast majority, maybe if you're trained more recently, some are. If you've trained with me, you definitely did. If you've taken a freediving class, you actually know. We'll talk more about that later. Somebody said yes. Okay, good on you. Yeah, so the number one thing we're supposed to do in scuba, the number one rule, keep breathing deep, slowly. We're not teaching people, actually. Let that sink in for a second. And I've talked to a lot of people, get around a lot of dive shows, teach a lot of clients. We're not teaching the number one thing in scuba. Just hold that in the back of your mind. That's part of what kind of led to this development of precision diving. And I'll get more specific on breathing later. But for now, that always didn't make sense to me. Why aren't we showing and demoing and practicing and trying a whole bunch of different ways and working on breathing? And we'll talk about why that's so important here in a minute. So precision diving started in technical diving. I am a member of the Cambrian Foundation dive team. We were the nonprofit that was on the USS Monitor for 10 years. We were the first non-governmental organization that had NOAA diving status. And NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's the federal government's ocean and weather study. They have big ships that do a lot of good research. When they're funded well, we get involved sometimes. But we were fortunate enough to be able to have scientific research diving status with them, and we were the first nonprofit, there are many now, that was able to do that. We come from an approach to diving that's not dogmatic. It's really very practical. We use diving as a taxi or as a conduit or as a transport mechanism to accomplish work, to do a task list, to accomplish research, or to recover equipment. The Russ C's example was on a multi-beam sonar head recovery we did for NOAA in a little under 100 meters. So technical diving requires, because it has much shorter air chains, much fewer things we can do as mistakes and have consequences, you tend to need to be better at the diving. And we come from an approach that we want to be multi-mode, multi-environment, multi-equipment capable. And that means we use the best tools, the best equipment, and really a good diver should be able to use almost any kit if they get time on the kit, and have, more importantly, minimal workup time in between. And I'll talk about some of that and how I've helped add to that, and how, coming from this group, we approach it. We also follow technique where we dive cave technique in wreck configuration. So we use equipment configurations and trims and tucking things in for the highest entanglement risk, and exercise and use diving skills for the most sensitive environment that we find that we dive in, which tends to be the cave. And if you ever get a chance to do some cave training, even if you're not a cave passion, I tend to like to say that cave diving is a bit like pregnancy. You is or you ain't a cave diver. It's not for everybody. But if you're passionate about cave diving, it's likely it's a passion. There's not a lot of casual cave divers, so to speak. But when you get to do that training, you very clearly learn right away that even a small fin flip in the wrong direction can silt or bring silt off the bottom. This isn't a cave diving presentation, but that's where our philosophy comes from. After working on this heavily, and Terrence, who was the founder and president of Cambrian Foundation, and I had some meetings with Patty and helped bring Patty into the technical fold way back in 2000, I believe that was the year. Helped consult on that a little bit. I quickly realized that the errors, and I've had tech students that couldn't keep their feet off the bottom of the pool when they were working on their stage bottles, on and off and on their stage bottles. And most of the problems I was seeing, if we had to spend 10 extra hours in the pool to get people performance ready for the dives, weren't technical diving problems. I found that they really were very basic, very open water problems. And that's kind of led to this idea. And performance diving is not about a class. And please don't make it a class, because it really applies to the most basic open water level beginning class, all the way up to the highest level of instructor training. I've used it at every level, and it's really a foundation that helps people be better. And we'll get more into it so you'll understand better. So it really is a place where we stand on the shoulders of giants. Most of the fatalities that have come in rebreathers, free diving, technical diving, are how we learned our lessons. So Sheck's Blueprint for Survival is literally based on the people that died doing it, not by that for cave diving. No single thing I'm about to talk about is probably unique. And many of you will probably say, oh, I do that already. I don't claim to be super innovative and unique on the individual skills, but packaging it together in a scaffolding and providing some sort of language we can all talk about is really where this is changing thought processes and helping people. I've been working with clients, and I get often calls from Hollywood, because I live in Hollywood, not Hollywood, but nearby in LA. And there's this tendency for stunt guys and people that need, get a call, hey, can you do underwater stuff? They'll say yes, no matter what. And I get these very entertaining calls that say, I need to be certified in 3 days. Okay. Can't really do 3 days probably, but you give me a week, I can probably get you set ready. I've been fortunate enough to work with some on-camera talent that came to me with very few dives, and within less than a dozen dives, they were able to control their diving and be on camera and be able to act in scenes on camera, whether that's an instructional video for an agency or on a movie, better than people with thousands of dives. So I know this works, but don't trust me. Don't trust me. Try it yourself. And because this takes integration and kind of some subconscious churning on, it can take 2 years for you to fully get it if you really practice this. I'm not going to get into the super, in the weeds detail today. We can certainly have some more things if we want to talk about specific things, Chantal. But the blog, precisiondiving.com, covers in great detail. And if you want to read it kind of in order, you can hit the foundational button on the right and go to the oldest post, read oldest to newest, and that should help. But I fully credit everybody I've ever trained with, everybody I've ever dived with. And back when I started technical diving, it wasn't called technical diving. I don't think Michael's here yet, but he coined the term way out of the 80s. And there was no interweb back then, no internet. So it was a lot harder when we kind of had little enclaves in different areas of the world, and we're just trying to figure it out. And I like to say that about 80% was pretty good. We kind of modified stuff from the Navy manual and the NOAA manual. And 20% probably could have killed me, so I'm kind of lucky I'm here. But we didn't know better. So I envy a little bit the people that have unlimited access to internet information. That's got its own issues I'm not going to bring up. Anybody can publish anything on the internet, including myself, so don't trust me. Verify, practice, try it. But I do stand on the shoulder of giants, and I'll try to provide credit wherever an idea came from as we go on today. So if you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them in text. It's kind of more of a workshop-y type thing, and I'll try to leave time at the end for questions. So a little bit of background. Competence comes in 4 forms. If you're not an educator, you may not understand kind of the levels of learning or competence. The first competence level is unconscious incompetence, meaning you don't know what you don't know. And this is very often the open water student, the brand new student that comes in, maybe to discover scuba diver person. They don't know what they don't know, and they very quickly realize and transform into the second level of competence known as conscious incompetence. Holy crap, I suck at this. And I remember being a 12-year-old kid with all that gear on, thinking, wow, this is kind of complicated. But the idea and draw for me with Jacques Cousteau on TV on the best Sundays of the month, being able to breathe and stay down for 45 minutes rather than having to work 2 minutes at a time was a huge yay for me. So I remember that first breath still today. It's a while ago now, 40 years ago now. But they did crazy stuff like make us try to eat bananas as our graduation in the pool underwater. I hate bananas. Plus, it's hard to eat a banana underwater. Don't recommend that. Please don't do that in class. But I quickly realized that I was conscious of my incompetence. And hopefully in an open water class, we transition people to conscious competence, meaning if they're thinking about it, they can do a decent job. And I believe most instructors really try to get there. I know I can do something with any diver in the world and figure out what level of operation they're on. And I'll talk about the last level in a second. What do you think I do with the diver to see how skilled they are and where they're operating from? You can use the text. However, leave them and watch. It does involve observation, yeah. Watch them. Actually, I hand them something. I'll give a hint that way. Watch them suit up, recorded them. We'll talk about videoing in a minute. I hand them a camera because what does a camera do? It changes their focus on what they're shooting. And I've seen thousands of divers with a camera in their hand, and they go, oh, sorry, a little loud probably. They get their operations, their dive skill falls apart almost immediately if they're acting from conscious competence. Because what I've done is I've distracted them because they're now into taking pictures. I'm sure we've all seen this. And I have other decks when I don't have to email them that have pictures of bad divers, not to call anybody out. But diving skills tend to degrade when there's object orientation outside of diving for most divers. And unfortunately, most training programs, and I watched Mark's talk here last week, and he talked about how training fails. And I think that part was true, and I agree with it, but he talked about asking people to practice, which is always good, and giving them something to practice. But I immediately thought of what we're going to talk about in a second is develop mindset. So the highest level of competence is unconscious competence. And probably everybody on here, if you drive, intimately knows unconscious competence because we've all been driving our car. Crap, that was my exit. That's because we're all unconsciously competent at driving and we're thinking about other stuff. Now, unconscious competence is very important, and the dive industry as a whole doesn't do a great job moving people from conscious competence to unconscious competence. Mindset, we'll talk about in a second, is very important because we want unconscious competence, but with consciousness. Because complacency and not paying attention to diving can cause its own set of problems. I think we'd all agree. If they dive better with a camera, that's a great question. They're probably already doing a bunch of this. They may not call themselves a precision diver, but you're probably already doing all this. So hopefully from this, you're getting a scaffolding, a way to communicate it, because the best innovations in the world uncommunicated really have no worth. Esoterically they do, but if the ideas can't get out, can't be adopted by other people, and by all means, I'd love to hear you all take ownership of these ideas. Talk about them if they're their own. If you're going to publish, then you can credit it in a little side note. But the more people that have ownership of these ideas, the more likely this is going to be to spread. And that's the point. And that's why I do this for free. And this is why I do most of the workshopping is always free. Doesn't mean if I'm traveling somewhere I won't do other courses, but I always try to make this an open invitation and free whenever possible, if it makes sense, because it's something I want to spread. Okay. So the camera use from Deborah is tying up her hands. We'll talk about hands in a minute. And I get that. I understand. So those are our 4 levels of competency. What this is not is a course. What this is not is a training agency. What this is not is a specific thing at a specific time. This really is a performance answer, because coming up and teaching for so long, I realized, as I said, my clients weren't feeling really great about their first dives. So for me, this is a way to try to bring into the equation a mindset and a building of confidence. And I don't have the magic marketing terms or the silver bullet on that. And I'd love any input you guys feel like you can provide, and think about it over time. And I'm happy to provide my email and the text at the end. Excuse me. But one word that really rings true with all my clients is confidence. And being confident means being in control of your diving, having skills that are rock solid. And a lot of people say, well, we don't have time to do that in an open water class. And I'm here to tell you, you can, and we can do a separate one for instructors if they want to learn how to teach this better. I'm not going to go in deep detail on that today. However, we can have confidence, and the best way to have confidence for divers and as individual divers is to know that our skills are going to do exactly in the water what we want them to. And I don't think as an industry we're doing that in an open water course especially. We're getting people consciously competent, but we're not necessarily integrating stuff as well as we should. So is there an end goal in mind when we're teaching? I think when you talk about diving, and if we asked 100 instructor trainers in a room, they would come up with different pictures of what that ideal should look like. What is the end goal? What does it mean to be an elite diver, like an elite athlete? We can look to Michael Jordan, or we can look to LeBron James in basketball, or I wish I had a current soccer champion, but Beckham maybe. That's dating myself already since he's retired. So the idea in precision diving is if we create a mental picture of where you should end up, your body will provide what your mind desires. And especially at the open water level, and why this got shifted to any level in open water, beginner level, is an open water diver's already overwhelmed. Why not overwhelm them with an elite mindset from the beginning? We don't want to overly task load them, but all the gear and everything else is going to task load them. They are going to be overwhelmed. That transition from conscious incompetence to conscious competence is an overwhelming process, but that's why we spend time in the water. Yes, more time in the water is better. I'm not here to bash the industry. I tend to spend a lot of time in the pool, and I actually spend about 2 to 3 hours in the shallow end, which we'll touch on a little bit in the future here. So I like to call it foundational thinking, and I start with a mindset first and try to get people to think about, what does it mean to be a great diver? What does it mean to be an elite diver? And we might get a lot of answers in that. Pele, yeah, I'm with you there. I remember I was a huge fan of his when I was playing soccer as a youth. We develop foundational thinking in precision diving because if we create a picture in the mind of where a person should end up, they naturally rise to that picture. And there are other details in that. There's a lot of good sports science around there, but having that modeling in mind matters. And skill integration is touched on, but we don't really, as an industry, paint a clear picture of when you quote unquote arrive. And that opinion of when you're a great diver changes a lot. So I'd like to put forward an idea. Let's keep it very basic and simple. A great diver is one that's in control of their diving at all times and aware of themselves and the environment around them at all times. That sounds like a lot, but it's very, very possible. And then you exercise that until that's automated. Now, when I say automated, I'm talking about muscle memory, but I've been bashed by my physio friends that there are no memory neurons in muscles, and they're generally termed automated motor responses. So I've kind of run with this from the idea of automaticity. So the difference between conscious competence and unconscious competence is the automaticity. And in layman's terms, the best way to get to that is to create a ritual. If you want it to become habitual, create a ritual. And habit is really something we just do over and over again. And diving is a mileage sport. So if you're internet diving and not getting wet, you're not going to make the final connection, because as great as my words might be, or the best language or marketing I can come up with, there are things beyond language. There are experiences that are beyond language. The other aspect of this effort has been the transformational economy stuff. And if you're with Patty and other places and Dive Center Business, I believe I had an article in, the Pine work in the experience economy is the kind of business solution. Diving transforms people, and everybody on this webinar, you're here because diving changed your lives forever in a profound way. And the very cool thing about diving is I can take someone to the same exact site, do the same exact skills, and each time they're a different diver. Not because I did something different, because they changed as a person. And that's very powerful. So we need to be aware of that, and you need to be aware of that as an individual diver. Is if you work on this, you're going to change as a human being. And all instructors have seen this with a person that might be a bit shy when they come into open water, and by the time they're a dive master, they're lecturing, and they're very much more open and engaging. We also see it in the performance. So when I work with somebody, even if we do the same exact thing on a different day, they're a different diver, and it's a totally different dive. But we start with mindset rather than skills. And it's what I like to call a performance mindset. And that involves using visualization, and we use terms like vivid visualization. This has been reinforced by my work in freediving, which is very much a psychological mental sport. A lot of the athletes have the same physical capabilities, but they have very different psychological makeups. And I like to say you can't hide from yourself in the water. That's true in scuba. That's even more true in freediving. And at the elite levels, It's very, very true. And the body will tend to produce what the mind genuinely and truly wants. And in freediving, I will hear a lot as a judge, oh, I had equalization problem. And I'll often say, equalization is not the problem. It's the stuff in between the ears that is the problem, meaning it's your brain that you may not have been ready psychologically. So since we can't hide from ourselves in the water, working on your own psychology and whatever that thing might be that gets in the way is a part of a performance mindset. It's getting ready to not run into those psychological barriers. And once you peel that onion and get to the next thing, you'll get to the next thing. And I've had athletes that we just stopped training because they were too distracted by something that happened in the day. I had one athlete that was estranged from her father, and she reconnected. It ended up well, which is great, but it also helped resolve that issue, and something else came up later. But we're all human. We need to have some empathy towards the psychological aspects of this too. So as I said, we'll rise to the level of our own expectations. So if you're an instructor or a diver, let's start really getting a good picture in our head, a snippet of video, so to speak. I kind of have a videographic memory, so video works good for me, of what it means to be really good. And that's a nice trim position. There's all the specifics on performance that several agencies are running with now. Definitely it's not on a sensitive bottom. Position's not as critical if you're hanging on deco in the mid-blue water. There are some physiological advantages at certain positions, but we're not here to speak to that today. But if we create that mindset, you develop that mindset, that idea that you're going to control your diving at every point in the dive, and nothing happens by accident, meaning everything is purposeful or it's a mistake. And as you get that ritual developed, these things will flag in your head because your brain is keyed into certain rituals. We're very habitual as a species. And when you break ritual, alarm flags tend to go off in the head. And those are good things for your post-dive debrief, which you should always do. So I'm sure some of you are thinking, but skill mastery. I thought that too. And it's very important. Individual skill mastery, and it's spoken to a lot in many systems. We want to train to mastery at the appropriate level, of course, and that holds true in this as well. But a lot of systems really kind of stop there. We're really about skill mastery, and we don't put a lot of voice and structure to skill integration. How do we fit those things together? In our head first, because it's got to make sense, and then help ritualize it, practice it, get that mileage. Pools are awesome kind of gyms, playgrounds, I like to call them. And it's not a new diver that needs the pool. We all need the pool. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So skill mastery, very, very important, but how the skills fit together and how you integrate that to be an elite diver, or if we want to use the term precision diver, that's fine. That matters more, because I can work on skills over time, and it's very important to learn the right skills the first time. There is an educational development process called primacy, which means the first thing you learn most and locks in. So it's another reason I brought this to the very beginning levels, because better to learn the best technique first and not be great at it and know what to practice and have a mindset on where you should end up than come to me later. And I found it takes about 10 times the energy and time and often money. And I'm the perfect example that I traveled all over the world because we really didn't have tech diving instructors in California. We had Wings. He was great, but he was up north, to try to find training, and didn't have an interweb to search it out. So it was all kind of word of mouth. It became very important, and I spent a lot of money to try to fix the bad habits I had developed because I didn't learn the best way first. So skill mastery is still very important, but it's the second item. Mindset, I'm here to preface and suggest should be first. So along with mindset, that's kind of our foundation, and then upon that we build foundational skills. And I picked that word carefully because other people have kind of taken over certain things as branding messages. But you guys can put in the text field if you'd like, what are some of the foundational skills of scuba diving? We'll stick with scuba today. Bit like golf then. Yep. Golf is very much a mental sport, and you have to exercise it to stay good. Surfing's the same way, actually. Buoyancy, very good answer. Being calm. Sorry, phone's ringing. Finning, yep, all right. Logical thinking. Yeah. Depends on the situation. We may not have logic to go to. That's why some ritual's good. Not to panic, good. That goes back to mindset. Sorry. Clearing your mask, very much a foundational skill, but not one of the foundationals we'll talk about today. Breathing, great. Yes, in scuba. So I was going to ask about other sports, but that's fine. We got a good list going here. And now I ask you to look at the industry and what we're telling people. Are we saying a mindset is important, or are we talking about certain skills? Mask clearing is a very important skill, but it doesn't necessarily. There's lots of people that dive a whole lot and only find out that mask clearing is a problem when they finally get water in their mask after their class. But every dive, we use certain foundational skills, and you've pretty much mentioned most of them already. And I'd like to preface that breathing, buoyancy, swimming, and trim are the foundational scuba skills. They are the ones that if you tend to do all four well, you're probably going to be in control of your diving. And we'll get more into detail this. And probably a lot of you are going, well, duh. But it's interesting. You look at things like schooling fish. I was going to put a little video on kind of how that very complex behavior happens. And we've all seen the fish storm and how they move and how can they possibly stay so close together. Well, it's actually only 2 rules that dictate, well, 3 sort of, dictates fish aggregations and how they move in very complex ways. It's swim as fast as you can, don't get too close to another fish, but don't get too far away either. So very elaborate and complex behaviors can be broken down to very bite-sized, simple pieces. So this, of course, are the 4 pillars of diving, as I like to call it, built on a foundation of mindset. Somebody said awareness. That is definitely a piece of the mindset. But breathing, buoyancy, swimming, and trim, if you do those, if you have control of those and mastery of those, and there's lots of different skills involved in that when you're teaching, you're probably doing pretty good. So the breathing comes from free diving. For me anyway, that's where I learned it first. If you sing, if you do martial arts, if you play a wind instrument, you probably use some of this breathing already. I like to call it diaphragmatically initiated breathing. Some will say belly breathing, but that's in my vocabulary an exercise to start learning the muscles. It's not just belly breathing, it's belly breathing initiation with a chest integration. I'm not going to teach breathing today, but we'll talk through it a little bit and we'll talk about why it's important. Breathing and free diving is very important because you're going to hold your breath. You want to make the breaths leading up to that super efficient and the best they can be, because you only have that to fuel your dive. Well, the ideal breathing they use, and that's the general term I use for proper breathing, so to speak, is to initiate from the diaphragm and blend the chest at the top, about halfway through. And there are reasons for this. We look at our lungs, and it makes sense, but the lower third of our lungs accomplishes 70% of our gas exchange. Now, if you've taken a diving class, you've probably seen this. You may or may not have heard this from elsewhere, but I would guess that very few people have learned this in a scuba class. It's an unfortunate thing. Now, some of this isn't magical or some mystery. We got a whole bunch of piping in the upper bits. But when I teach breathing, remember, we all, well, not all, but almost everybody agreed that we aren't teaching breathing in an open water beginning class. And why aren't we teaching the number one skill? I'll flash back to that. But we also should actually teach it. And I tried to get this integrated in tech level classes because in open circuit, in closed circuit in certain ways, especially at extreme death, but in open circuit, it's survival. That gas duration matters. So proper breathing and idealizing that gas exchange for the highest level of efficiency is a survival skill. And it's a huge confidence builder, which I'll address in a second. But the lower third of the lungs has most of the surface area for gas exchange. So I like to say, fill your lungs from the bottom, but empty them from the top. So when we breathe in, I kind of imagine, rich air full of fresh oxygen and very low CO2 going to the bottom part of my lungs first, and then I empty it from the top. The idea is to get the lungs to empty so that the gas stays in the richest exchange area for the longest time. And this isn't skip breathing. This is just highly efficient breathing, often known Pranayama yoga uses it as a breathing technique. You're not holding your breath. And photographers, somebody is a photographer. I think Deborah said she was a photographer. We often pause our breathing, but it's not an active hold. We never want to hold our breath. But if you leave your glottis open, if you were to rise where you're pausing, that air should be free to come out. So never ever consciously or unconsciously hold your breath. I don't want anybody confusing that. And one of the default responses as a non-diver is generally to hold your breath and panic and bolt for the surface. And I'm sure anybody who's an instructor is shaking their head because it's really happened to very many of us. So creating rituals to help that change is part of teaching diving. Breathing, feeling secure in your breathing, leads to the other four. It is the foundational of all foundational skills. Because the reality is, when I learned to dive, and for many, many years, when I was taught buoyancy, we talked about the BCD, the buoyancy control device, and you got to let air out and let air in. And it took me a long time before I realized, well, if I'm going up and I'm feeling buoyant and I'm rising without control, what's more intimately in my control? My lung volume or reaching for a BCD that I may not be super ritualized on or automated towards, or maybe it's not where I normally have it. Well, if I exhale and then breathe off the bottom of my lung, I just added 5 pounds of negative buoyancy, or took away 5 pounds of positive buoyancy, or even a bit more. One of the exercises I do in the pool with people is put weights on the ground of the bottom of the pool and have them pick them up, and don't touch the buoyancy control device. Don't touch the BCD. Consciously change your lung volume. And the solution to my friend out in the ocean on the tech dive during decompression, bouncing up and down, wanting to invent a device, is use your breathing. We have ideal breathing, but if we're in control of our breathing, we can choose to deviate from ideal to accomplish something else. So if I pick something up and I'm negatively buoyant, I can stay at a higher lung volume and purposely keep more air in the bottom part of my lungs. Also, if my feet are a bit heavy for some reason, I can keep air in the bottom of the lungs, which changes my trim. So breathing is the ultimate control. It's not just the fine tuning that most of us learned in our open water class. It's massive buoyancy change that's very intimate and controlled directly by us instantaneously, which is a survival skill. And it's a huge confidence builder. If someone's having trouble equalizing and they're I can see this in my head with hundreds of students early in my career, trying to get the BCD to correct the problem. Now I say, just take a big full inhale. Breathe off the top of your lung. You just added 5 pounds of buoyancy, may even rise up a little bit, and you have plenty of time to fix and not struggle with damaging your ears. So it provides a lot of control, and a lot of control means confidence and effectiveness or capability. And attitude certainly comes in this as well. Call it Graves' razor. There's an inverse relationship between bad attitude and capability or accomplishment. It's kind of maybe even exponential. So the worse the attitude, the nice thing about the water is all bad attitudes dissolve in water, we like to say. don't usually use that word. We use other words. But anyway, I think hopefully this starts to get you thinking on the importance of breathing leading into these other three terms. And also, hopefully, if you hadn't heard that efficiency to the breathing and use of gas and gas exchange really does change if you keep the gas in your lungs dwelled or placed in the lower third for a longer period of time. And it's not holding your breath. It's simply fill from the bottom, empty from the top. Then somebody mentioned buoyancy as a key skill. Absolutely. But as I alluded to already, breathing is buoyancy. And I'll guarantee you, if somebody's having issues with buoyancy, watch their breathing. I'll bet you money their breathing's out of whack. Because if their breathing was in control and they recognized the buoyancy change or felt something in their ears and adjusted their breathing to adapt to that immediately, they have plenty of time to now go to the equipment, find that inflator. It relaxes the stress in the situation dramatically. And how we breathe dramatically impacts buoyancy. One of the things that struck me early on was we're often taught to ascend by reach up, look up, come up, finger on the BCD to let gas out as we come up. But what we really don't do is say move with breath. I don't swim on ascents ever, even with 6 cylinders on me and big 140 kilo kits or whatever. I simply use lung volume to slowly create a little positive buoyancy, come back to neutral. And as I need to adjust the dry suit or adjust my BCD, my buoyancy control device, I adjust it. But my breathing is my primary buoyancy control. Those are very gross, big adjustments, keeping my dry suit with enough so I'm not getting squeezed and really uncomfortable, making sure deco stays okay, or even at the open water level in a 10-foot dive, a 3-meter dive, exploring a reef, just taking some photos or doing a fish count. Being better makes the dive more enjoyable. So breathing and buoyancy tie together. That's why when we teach breathing, we need to teach people the correct pour breathing. And generally that's accomplished by extending exhalation first because it's the passive and relaxive side of it. I'm not going to get into that level of detail today. So then swimming also, of course, matters. And do we swim for propulsion or from the glide after propulsion? You can use the text. Glide after. Good answer. Glide after. Yes. This is why trim matters, which we'll talk about in just a second. But it's also why technique matters, but keeping hydrodynamic after propulsion is way more important. I didn't put the drag equation up today, but one key component of the mathematical formula for drag, and we know water is how much more dense than air? I believe 800 times. We need to give time for the water to move, so sometimes we need to slow down to speed up. And how we swim, we all know when you're working really hard and trying to go fast, that's a huge amount of work. If we give time for the water to move a bit slower, you can actually go faster. And I've done this with students. One example here is taking the fins off. You'd be surprised. Do this in the pool first, and we started in the shallow end. But if you want to teach foot angulation, you want them to get technique, you can get surprising movement out of just using your feet. And it naturally gets the diver used to the right angles, because if you don't get the angles right, guess what happens? You go nowhere. So it's just one technique I'm giving, but please do this in a confined and controlled environment first. And if the conditions are appropriate in the ocean, bring it to the ocean second. But swimming is about gliding. So think about tucking in, and we can imagine a profile of a diver and how much surface area is here. And in scuba terms, I think in empirical, 64 pounds per cubic foot is what water weighs. And if you create a lot more surface area and add several square feet and you move a foot, it's that much extra thrust you need to exert to move forward or backwards or spin in a circle. And in an open water class, we teach finning and often only teach one method of finning. Some don't. I teach several methods, just like I teach several methods for mask clearing or work on different techniques to accomplish skill mastery. There's nothing against spending time teaching them different finning techniques. And do we want anti-silting technique? We don't need to make them a cave diver. We don't want to expect cave level performance, but it's not bad that I know of in any agency to show more than one way of finning. And with a good confident diver, if you spend a lot of time teaching breathing, getting them to see how big their buoyancy change is, work on finning, even take the fins off in the shallow end first, I promise you, it seems like a lot of time up front, you will save huge amounts of time, and people generally will already be a diver. They'll be swimming, they'll be breathing, they'll have decent trim, and their buoyancy will actually be pretty good. And they've had lots of time to fidget around as they get a bit bored, and you want them to kind of get ritualized and a bit bored. They're much more familiar with their equipment. And you can even come up with a little slate and say, where's this? And make them touch it. It's called a touch drill. And then trim, of course, is how we profile, how we weight. Overweighting is a huge issue in most places with inexperienced people. By teaching proper breathing, we arm people, we empower people with a technique that allows to compensate if they feel slightly underweighted. We can and purposely deviate from ideal breathing and bring it into a low bottom of the lung, temporarily less full breath, but it's for a reason. It's compensating for goofing on the technique, on the amount of weight a bit. And this is where logs come in big time. Keeping track, I don't use my log necessarily as my flight record. I have thousands and thousands of dives. It's more about setting up a weighting strategy. That's part of that mindset. Knowing your gear and what kit you need to transition from one kit to another, multi-mode, multi-environment capable, is having that strategy. And trim is as much strategy and breathing as it is moving weights around. But my rule is with equipment is if it causes an issue on one dive, fix it. If it causes an issue on a second dive, diving is way too important. It changes you as a human. Buy a new set of gear, swap it out, solve the problem within 2 dives. We all know, I've certainly had dives where you go out diving and your buddy's like, that's the best dive I've ever had. This is incredible. And I'm like, oh, my mask was leaking the whole time. It sucked. But orcas were circling your head and manta rays were swimming by. Yeah, but I couldn't see them because my mask was flooding the whole time. Guess how long I keep that mask? That's gone. Diving is so important and the experiences are so valuable that the cost of a new mask is pennies on the dollar for me anyway. So I get a new set of kit, a new piece of kit, if it's causing me an issue more than once. Otherwise, I'm trying to fix it. But you're always fine-tuning the kit built around a mindset. So bringing it all together is establishing a mindset, giving them an in-picture, an end goal in mind from the beginning, and this can be by video. I highly, highly recommend, somebody said video analysis and videoing as standards allow, or with a DM or an assistant. Every level of class, I bring video analysis in because I can tell somebody till I'm blue in the face, but showing them, especially up on a whiteboard where I can put a level and draw a line and really, really analyze technique, that registers much better than words can, because a lot of this is feeling, and I'm a firm believer that some things are beyond words. And diving is one of those things that really needs to be experienced because you don't know what it's like without really actually doing it to the intimate level that we all experience it. So there's a whole lot to bringing it together as an instructor. The main thing is be better this dive than last, be better next dive than this. Always sharpen the saw, to steal the first habit from Stephen Covey. So I'm borrowing as well. My uncle often said, the Greeks invented everything. We're just rebranding. We're just rebranding it, putting it a new name. So start shallow in the pool, take it deep in the pool, use the pool as your training ground, your gym, and then take it shallow in the ocean and work it deeper. Whether that's rebreather, freediving, whatever, you want to ritualize your behaviors, create that habit that you repeat over and over again. Obviously, it's better to learn the best way first, primacy. All of these things come together, and then make sure you're kind of mentally keeping track as you dive. If you kick a piece of coral, or your flat turn wasn't as efficient as you wanted it to be, or you bumped into somebody, or you didn't have awareness and you brushed somebody, and often that's their issue because they came on to you, but those things should begin to develop to a place where they're automatic. They kind of red flag in your brain, and I almost see a flag come up in my head. Bing! Oops, keep track of that. That's part of the debrief. I want to talk about that. I'm going to work on that. And then challenge yourself. Hover nose off a rock, something that you won't hurt. Can you do that within a foot for minutes? I've challenged myself sometimes, not in a dry suit necessarily, but sometimes to tuck my thumbs into my waist belt and see if I can't use my hands. I'm not a huge fan of hands in front. I understand why it's happening. It's almost a different talk. The problem is hands are used to hold stuff. So if you put a camera in, your performance is going to suffer if you're used to using that as for lift. And my personal opinion is often that's used to fight heavy fins, because like a spoiler on a Formula One car, it creates lift. It makes it easier to stay in trim. And the easiest way to tell this is to not move, because when we move, it's easier to be buoyant because we're creating lift. If you go static, you tend to see where the natural positioning is. And I think Andrea, a couple of days ago in her seminar, talked about dead float, where you truly relax, which is not a bad thing to do in open water. And it tells you a lot of where people might naturally trim. So that's what I have. I'd love to answer any questions. I'm going to put my email if people want to reach out to me in the text. I hope you enjoyed it today. Thank you for spending an hour with me. I respect the amount of man hours that I've consumed today, and I hope you feel something worthwhile came about of it.
Thank you, Grant.
Yes, a torch is similar to a camera. Or picking up something, treasure on the bottom as you dive, not actual treasure if we don't want to violate laws.
Right, so Grant, thank you very, very much for giving that wonderful webinar and presentation. I'm sure that a lot of us have actually learned quite a bit. For those of you in the audience, we'd love some questions. If you have any questions for Grant, that would be very, very useful. Everybody's saying many thanks. Thanks. I think you gave them all the answers, Grant.
Well, I don't mind questions, and I don't mind being challenged. And if you do, some people have reactions and say, but I've always been doing this. Great, bring it. I'm not afraid. This is an open forum, an open platform, open source effort. So by all means, adapt it, bring it. If you'd like to try this and want to bring a guest blog post, I'm happy to do that and publish your impressions on the blog. I probably will eventually do something more commercial with it, like a book series. Right now, I'm a grad student. It's a little hard to even think about doing that. Are there any questions, Chantal?
Yes, there is actually. So first of all, George Otto says, great thought on fundamentals. Thank you. And then Kevin says, are there any particular drills you do if you have been out of water for a while?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I do exactly what I do with the beginning diver. I start in a meter of water in the shallow end of the pool. And I'll even lay flat on the bottom just to feel how my kit is, and am I trimming and arching my back a little bit and getting the head position correct. And then I'll work on the finning techniques, all the basic foundational stuff. I work on my breathing and do big full volume exchanges and hit the surface and hit the bottom and hit the surface and hit the bottom, and re-engage that intuition and that automated motor response and that automaticity, and get that ritual kind of back in the feeling mode. And then I'll work on swimming where I'm not touching the bottom or the surface, and still full volume, but adjusting where I inhale and exhale based on where I am in the water, and using a slow inhalation and exhalation, but having it hold position based on propulsion and things like that. You really can't do that full volume if you're not moving. But when you create lift or you have rough seas, you can adjust your breathing and stay in solid position. One of the remarks that came to me as lighting or filming underwater grip is that I don't move no matter what happens. And I have to say it's totally unconscious at this point, and it's simply that breathing control and intuitively feeling the water around me and the water movement, naturally adjusting lung volumes and buoyancy through my lung volumes to where I can stay completely static and hold the light on the subject, and the shoot doesn't get interrupted because the light comes off. That's a commercial application, but great question. From the shallow end, I go back to the deep end, and I'll often use the weights on the bottom, often 2 or 3 kilos, sometimes more, sometimes only 1 kilo or 0.8 kilos. Pick them up and have no perceptual change. And that translates to tech diving. When I'm in tech diving, we don't move from the pool to the ocean or open water, sometimes it's lakes, until that stage can be doffed and donned with no swimming position change. If I want to use a camera and get back in the camera, I'll take the camera in the pool. Am I being a conscious diver and or unconscious competent diver and protecting the environment and able to hold position and fin backwards or flat turn and get the images and hold steady and do good on video? I hope that answers the question. And then I take it in the ocean and work it deeper. If it's a significant change, I do more of that. And I'm very conservative on, if it's a tech kit, I won't trimix dive in a substantial kit change until many, many dives go by.
Okay. So Ed Benjamin says, very good advice and info. Then we have Tony says, love the section on breathing, very enlightening, thanks. And then Robert says, amazing technology, LA to Europe and back to St. Jose. And then Ray says, do you think side mount diving changes your concept of precision?
Not at all. I love side mount. For me, it's primarily a cave configuration, just because in the 90s when it was introduced to me, I really only used it for I have nothing against it in open water. I think it's easier in certain respects because you're much more streamlined than a doubles kit, but it has its own set of challenges. Trim matters a great deal there, and then how the cylinders get aligned matters a great deal. When you're a bigger dude like myself, you may have to check and modify some of the rings and to get those really being streamlined. A chunk of side mount that I see out there, because it's kind of the du jour technique or mode of diving at the moment, a lot of the streamlining, when you look at trim, is pretty poor. A lot of stage bottles are that way. So I would take a deep look at really the drag factor, because you're gaining a lot of less drag through the configuration. So you want to take full advantage of that and really work with finning as well. But you also want to give time for the water to pass over you. So slower, maybe faster. And I've done some experiments with students where we timed them swimming as fast as they could, following the lane lines in the pool in the shallow end. So there's no threat psychologically. And then I say, do perfect technique in your mind as best you can. And they often finish minutes faster. So sometimes slower is faster.
Excellent. Right. So Anthony says, your opinion on the importance of teaching how to snorkel prior to diving.
I'm not against it. I'm obviously a very large advocate for free diving. I do a lot of judging and training a lot of judges and put a lot of volunteer time. I was the president for U.S. Freediving, and I've been involved in ADA committees and vice president for quite some time. I have nothing against it. I would not free dive after scuba. Physiologically, there's probably some risk to that. If you want to build water skills through free diving, I believe scuba is a transformational process and free diving is transformational on steroids. So the mind-body connection, the ability to feel the water with a lot of kit on, it's harder. Things are slower. In free diving, propulsion is all about the glide, especially in the pool events. Not so important. It does matter for recreational or spearfishermen, but it's not as recognized by the individual. So you got to point it out a bit. But sure, learning to be a free diver first doesn't hurt. Learning to free dive after being a seasoned diver is certainly good cross training, whether you stick with it or not.
What about breathing through a snorkel without a mask?
I have nothing against that. It definitely teaches mouth breathing. If they're sitting in the shallow end and can stand up, they get a little water up their nose, no harm, no foul. And there are a lot of nose breathers, and a lot of people will default back to nose breathing. So it can be a good survival kind of break old ritual. So I have nothing against that at all. And ideal breathing with the added dead airspace really matters a lot to try to maximize your gas exchange, because you have some challenges there physiologically.
Excellent. So Simon says, excellent. I use a line for buoyancy and trim practice. Very useful to learn in cave diving.
It's a total necessity. Absolutely, yes.
Then Anthony says, what do you think is the hardest skill for new divers?
It's very individual. I'll start with that. As a professional, I believe we owe our full professional capability no matter what you're being paid. So that's why you're here as a coach, is to help diagnose some of the issues and talk through it with your clients. But I would say in debriefing, let your clients lead the debrief. Let their experience rule their experience. Don't tell them what it should be. We often as instructors like to say, that giant sea bass was incredible. It was this and that and this. Better to shut up and ask them what they felt, because their experience is unique to them. So I would say diagnose. Part of this process of precision diving, which I didn't get much into, is diagnosing faults or strengths and building from that. So breathing is a challenge because most of us aren't taught how to breathe properly. So that I've had people, even high-level instructor trainers with 10,000 dives, far more than me, can't actuate the muscles because they've never consciously controlled. It tends to be an unconscious process.
That's excellent, because Anthony says perfect. That's what he'd like to hear. So John says, so how many pool sessions and for how long is your typical open water classes?
I would say it's probably, now I know some people are very pool challenged and it's much more expensive today than it was back in the day, even for myself. Most of my courses recently are smaller private, semi-private situations, but it's not longer than I spent. And even on group classes, the time up front seems more, but I gain that back by just less time with them struggling with gear or floating to the surface. Generally, after that 2 to 3 hours in the shallow end, they are not moving up and down unless they want to. They have much greater control. So the subsequent skills happen in quick succession, not rushing it, but there's less of the awkward writing and the pulling them down and all of that going on. So there's a lot less wasted time. So I spend 6 to 8 hours with a smaller group. That could go up usually over 2 days. That's just kind of the format. If it's a private, it's whatever, because we stay as long as I feel we need to, and we're hiring the pool or a lane or whatever. And with a big group class, that doesn't change a ton. It's just a bit longer, probably more like 8 to 10 if I have that. But number one rule as an instructor, don't take a problem child from the pool to the ocean. It does not get better. So that's where you have conversations on a daily talking about, we need to probably schedule a remedial session, because the group class is cheaper for a reason. If you want that individualized perfect attention, then a private is the way I go. It doesn't mean it's less than. It just means I don't have the time to solve the problems when I have 8 people to deal with. So that needs to become a private situation to catch you back up.
Excellent. Brock has a brilliant statement. He goes, side mount forces you to streamline your kit.
I would like to believe that all kits force you to streamline your kit if you're paying attention, but yes, you dramatically notice differences because it's inherently a far more streamlined thing. So if you're with other very streamlined divers and you're struggling to keep up, even in twin set and stages, I'm barely flicking my fins. And believe it or not, I often, not in the cave environment, but in open water, I use split fins because it's super efficient and I barely need to move. And I'm having to be consciously super slow with people that are not as trimmed out or newer and getting used to it, simply because I glide better. And that's free work. That's free gains. That means I get better gas consumption. I burn a lot less calories due to inefficiencies. But yes, streamlining in side mount tends to be much more obvious for people.
Okay.
Make it obvious for your students and other kids too.
Excellent. Anthony says, how do we teach the mindset of the main agency to teach more breathing skills? How do we change the mindset?
I've tried. Good luck. I think they're open, but I've literally tried to give this one it into precision diving because they wouldn't take it. I sneak it into some of the texts I work on. The one thing we have the power to influence for sure is our impact and what we actually have influence over. So start with you and your students. Talk about it. Use it yourself. Your performance will gain questions. If you're looking super sharp in the water, people are going to ask about it.
Excellent.
Don't create an instructor-student relationship, though, if you're in the United States, because there's a liability problem with that. That's why I was kind of not super detailed here. I don't want to have you sue me saying we created an instructor-student relationship.
Right. Right. So, John said, thank you. Robert says, thanks for a very informative and educational. Anthony says, if there are 6 students with an hour pool, it's less than 15 minutes per student then.
I'm not doing one at a time. This is done as a group. And the nice thing about using the shallow end is if there's an issue, they can stand up. So I can demo fin use and have the whole group swim in a circle around the shallow end. And if there's an issue, they stand up. I'm still in control. I'm still visualizing this. But by making the beginning session super shallow, one, buoyancy is harder. Breathing has a much bigger impact in that buoyancy and on the diver. And 2, if they feel threatened or have an issue, they can stand up. And with the added time and almost getting a bit bored, I have the time to address an issue with a student that might be less skilled or psychologically having a harder time. It gives me time to put in some extra time. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, he does understand. Anthony says, I understand. I just think that more than one, understand. I just think more one time is better. But
absolutely. And I have plenty of clients that pay for privates and we spend hours. So that time's the same for like the 6 hour in usually it's never under 6 hours, even if it's a single person for me. And it's more if I feel they need it. And I'll use Pella floats, which are floats on a line, and I add weight because it needs a little more weight than just the weight on the little Pelican float. Any float that's submerged, you can use as a sight line to help with hovering at different areas. And then I'll have people use breathing without any movement to go from one level to another and stabilize. So that's kind of a near the end of the session, end of the pool time exercise. And I bring that back in the open water. I bring that back at every level, and pretty much every level student, I assess them and bring them into a pool first, no matter what, if I haven't experience with them or it's been any time.
Excellent. All right, Grant. That's basically all of the questions. I want to thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your insight. I really, really appreciate that. And for all the attendees who joined us today, we thank you very, very much for attending. Will says 1,000,000 thanks or 1,000 thanks, Grant, and everybody else is saying thank you. So obviously, great job, Grant. So we hope that we'll get you back soon again. And for those of you who are hoping to attend a webinar tomorrow, unfortunately, we've had a few dropouts due to unforeseen circumstances, but they're fine. It's just some of them forgot.
Riot.
All got a little bit too busy and carried
Still made
it. Thank you, Grant, for making it.
They're burning cars a block away from my apartment, but it's all good.
Yeah, that's pretty hectic. So for those of you who are hoping that there is a webinar on Wednesday and Thursday, we have a break. But on Friday, we have Ian France, and he's going to be talking about cave expedition, which is going to be absolutely amazing. And I mean, I can't even pronounce his cave that he's doing. It's Vegfeljun, 9 Norwegian cave. So hopefully I pronounced it properly. So he's pretty awesome on his talks and all that. So hopefully you'll join us on Friday, 6 p.m. Same time. So thank you very, very much, everybody, for joining us. And I hope
anybody wants to read more, precisiondiving.com and grantwgraves@gmail.com. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thanks, Grant.
Thank you, Chantal.
Okay, for the rest of you, have a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. God bless everybody. Bye.